Amber Heard has made it clear that she's no fan of religion and Christianity, and she's publicly talked about how, even though she was raised in a religious home, she knows that she'll never be religious again.
Did you have problems with your family?
And he said, baby girl, can't be an atheist. And I was like, but I am.
And in an interview with Misbehave magazine, she also said that she knows enough about Christianity and Catholicism to know that they're too absurd for her to believe in. But she didn't always feel this way. When she was 16, something tragic happened that led her to give up on belief in God entirely and to become an atheist. And although I truly do sympathize with what she went through and can only imagine how difficult that was, I don't believe that what happened to her should have made her an atheist, but instead, if anything, I believe that it should have made her a Christian. Now, I'm sure that might have sounded incredibly arrogant and ridiculous, but just hear me out. Let's start with what happened. When Amber was 16, she was going to a Catholic high school when things took a turn that would change her life forever. One day, she learned that her best friend was involved in a car accident and unfortunately passed away. Of course, this was hard on Amber, and it affected every area of her life, especially her religious views. Having a difficult time processing her friend's death, she dropped out of Catholic high school and she became an atheist at the age of 16. Now, first off, for anyone who's lost anybody close to them, especially at a young age, they know just how traumatizing and difficult that kind of loss can be. So I have nothing but empathy for her when it comes to her experience, and my intent in this video is not at all in any way to downplay what she went through. I completely understand just how hard something like that can be. But this still leads to the question of, why did this tragedy turn her into an atheist? After all, some people who have experienced a similar tragedy found themselves converting to religion rather than rejecting religion because of it. So specifically, what is it about this tragedy that made her stop believing in God? Well, she doesn't go into any depth in any of her interviews, but in order for the tragedy to lead her to the conclusion that God didn't exist, she had to believe that if God did exist, then a tragedy like that wouldn't have happened. But since the tragedy did happen, then she concluded that God didn't exist. Now, this may shock you, but in a way, I agree with her here. If she's right in her assumption that God wouldn't allow tragedies to occur, then she would be right to conclude that God didn't exist after learning about the tragedy of her friend. The only problem that I have with that is, I just don't think she's right to think that we shouldn't expect tragedies to occur if God existed. For me, here's one way that I think about it. The other day, actually, I was thinking about my son's first trip to the dentist, which was a disaster. When the dentist came in, as usual, he was trying to make my son happy and trying to make him laugh, but my son was just not having it that day. So after a few minutes of the dentist trying to calm him down, my son started screaming and kicking and crying even more, and he looked at me and he reached up to me for me to save him. But instead of grabbing him and running out of the front door, I actually had to hold him down so that way the dentist could continue to look inside of his mouth. Now keep in mind, not only could my son not understand why I didn't save him while he was reaching out to me, but he also couldn't understand why I actually had to hold him down and allowed him to suffer. I wanted him to understand that this was for the greater good, but I knew that he couldn't even understand because he wasn't even capable of understanding basic language at this point, let alone the greater concept of the greater good. But just because he couldn't comprehend the fact that there was a greater good that came from it, did that mean that I didn't have a greater good in mind? Of course not. So in a similar way, for me, I don't see why it couldn't be the same with God. If God created the entire universe and he literally knows everything that there is to know, then he would also know how everything has to happen in order to achieve the greater good, even if I can't see or comprehend it. Now, because I know how the internet gets, just to be clear, the point of the story is not comparing the event of my son going to the dentist with Amber's friend dying. That's not the point of the comparison. The point of the comparison is just to highlight how limited our minds are and why it's not true that just because we can't think of a greater good for why God would allow something to happen, it doesn't mean that God doesn't have a greater good in mind. And the last thing I want to say about that is free will is also a greater good. Although free will comes with the ability to make bad and wrong decisions that could possibly end a life, we would still rather have it because with free will also comes the greatest good of not being a robot and being able to love people deeply and authentically. So in my mind, the tragedy of her friend could only prove that there is no God if we knew that there was no greater good that came from the tragedy, which of course we couldn't possibly know. But of course, this still doesn't prove that Christianity is true. And if you remember at the beginning, I said I don't believe that what happened to her should have made her an atheist, but instead, if anything, I believe that it should have made her a Christian. So now the question is giving the reasoning that she used in order to conclude that Christianity was false, given her standards, what would it take to prove that Christianity is true? If we shouldn't expect for any tragedies to happen if Christianity were true, then she would be right that tragedies would be evidence that Christianity is false. But if she's intellectually consistent, then that means that if tragedies are expected on Christianity, then that would of course be evidence that Christianity is true. And one way this can be shown is if Christianity teaches the concept of the greater good at its core. Let's consider the facts. So to start, Christianity is based on Jesus, and Jesus said, in this life we will have trouble. So we should expect tragedy to occur in life according to Jesus. But rather than quoting Jesus and other verses, even more significantly, at the core of Christianity, it's not just based on the life and resurrection of Christ, but also on the tragic death of Christ. It's here that we see the fulfillment of that greater good concept. It was through one man's tragic death that the greatest conceivable good came about, salvation as a free gift to those who accept it. From his suffering and death came our ability to live eternally without suffering and death. This means that at its core, Christianity is the ultimate example of God using tragedy in order to accomplish the greatest good. And it's because of this that we can trust that a greater good will come from tragic events that we see and experience in our lifetime. So with that being said, if we were to accept Amber's mindset that she used in rejecting Christianity, then we could confidently say that if tragedies occurring prove anything about Christianity, rather than proving it false, instead, they would actually only prove that Christianity is true. And something similar can be said for Amber's ex, Johnny Depp, who also became an atheist at a young age, but for very different reasons. However, I think that Johnny's reasons also should have led him to accept Christianity rather than rejecting it. So go ahead and click on this video to see what I mean, and I'll see you over there. But before I go, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what do you mean?